Welcome back. Today we are making an Oreo drip cake. So this cake has got so many Oreos in it in so many different places. To start off with, we're going to be frosting the cake with an Oreo buttercream. So I actually have a full tutorial on how I make this buttercream. It's really just my classic American buttercream with some super crushed Oreos mixed into it, but there's a little bit more to it, so if you want to learn more about that, you can click the link in the upper right corner. The recipe is also up on Chelsweets.com if you want to recreate it. So once I had my Oreo buttercream all ready to go, it was time to assemble our cake. I began by spreading just a little dab of this buttercream on my 10-inch grease-proof cake board to help keep my cake layers in place as I assembled it. This cake is made with my chocolate layer cake recipe, which has great structure but is also really moist and delicious, and I'm spreading a very generous layer of Oreo frosting on that. I wanted a bit of texture in the cake too, so I added some chopped up Oreos, and I also added a chocolate ganache drizzle. So this totally isn't necessary, but I always have some chocolate ganache in my fridge. I keep my leftovers in there, and I just thought this cake could use a tiny bit more chocolate. So I repeated this process with my remaining cake layers, and these are 7-inch cake layers. I usually like to use one batch of batter to make 4 7-inch cake layers, but if you only have 8-inch pans, you can also make 3 8-inch cake layers. Since I was adding drips to this cake, I kind of wanted it to be tall so it could have some dramatic long drips, but if you don't like really tall cakes because they're hard to cut, or you just don't like that shape in general, you can always make wider cake layers and your cake will end up being shorter. So once all my cake layers were stacked, I went to work on my crumb coat. And as most of you know by now, a crumb coat is just a thin layer of frosting that covers all the cake layers and helps trap in any crumbs so that way you can get a really smooth finish on your second coat of frosting. To do this, I like to use both my offset spatula and a bench scraper, and I do the same process with my second layer of frosting. If you want to see a full tutorial on how to get super smooth sides on a cake, you can click the link in the upper right corner. It's a bit more detailed than this, but it's really just doing this about 20 times until you're happy with how smooth your frosting is. To take care of those top edges, I used a smaller offset spatula just because it gives me a little bit more control and helps me get those nice sharp edges. Next, I added some crushed Oreos around the base of the cake. Ideally, you would do this when the frosting is still soft, so you don't have to add any around the base. Unfortunately, I forgot about this step and I popped the cake into the freezer, so I just added a little bit of extra frosting to help those Oreo pieces stick in place. Next, it was time for our white chocolate drip. So for this, I really don't like to use candy melts for drips. I just don't like the way they taste and the concept kind of creeps me out. So I always use white chocolate chips. However, a lot of white chocolate chips naturally have a yellow hue to them once they're melted down, just because of the cocoa butter that's in them. But with that in mind, there are certain brands that are more white than others, so like Guittard and Ghirardelli white chips I think have a pretty good base color, and then you can add a tiny bit of purple gel food coloring to the mix to help balance out those yellow tones. So that's what I did here, and it's not a perfect white, but it actually goes pretty well with the gray frosting. So as you guys can see, I'm using a spoon to add these drips. Sometimes I use a squirt bottle, sometimes I use a spoon. It really comes down to preference. The spoon method definitely takes longer, but you have a little bit more control and it allows you to get bigger drips. And so that's the reason I use them on this cake. I added some leftover ganache to the top of the cake just to fully cover it, and then I smooth that out using a large offset spatula. As you do this, you want to have a really light touch because if the ganache is kind of warm and you press too hard, it can kind of melt the buttercream, so just be careful as you do this. To add a little extra flair to this cake, I decided to add some crushed Oreos onto my drips. Now this is a very time-consuming process and takes a lot of patience, so be sure you're ready before you begin. You should be able to do this pretty much right after you add your drips because the cake should be fully chilled, so that will help the ganache kind of firm up and be the right consistency where you can touch it and you won't ruin their shape. Once I had covered my drips with Oreo crumbs, I piped some really massive swirls of Oreo buttercream on top of the cake. I nestled some full Oreos between each swirl, and then I repeated this pattern around the entire top of the cake. As you do this, be sure that you really press those Oreos into the top of the cake so that they stay in place. And just like that, our Oreo drip cake is complete. Of course, me being me, I never know when to stop, so I also added some more crushed Oreos on top of each swirl. But this part is totally optional. So that really is the last step. Our Oreo drip cake is finally complete, and now it's time to cut into this cake. So my tips for getting a really clean slice on a tall cake like this is to be sure that your knife is heated up a little bit by dipping it in some hot water and drying it off, and also being sure to use a large, sharp knife. If you want to recreate this cake, the recipe is up on chelsweets.com. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.